The Innovative Computing Systems presentation on moving law firm infrastructures to the cloud. We originally set this presentation up by request from Jill Dietz, the program coordinator for ILTA, the International Legal Technology Association, to discuss for our ILTA friends in South Carolina. We've got a group there at McAngus Goodalock there in South Carolina. Thank you, Roland, for hosting that large group. And we also have about 20 people registered across the country, mostly on the West Coast, but some from other disparate locations. By default, we muted everybody on entry. We do want to have a very interactive session, however. So if anybody has questions, feel free to unmute and ask your question. If you're on the screen, you can just do that by doing your space bar, or you can go over to the right hand and click the mute button. But we do ask if you unmute yourself to try to keep background noise to a minimum. As you may have heard, we will be recording today's session, and it'll be made available on our website along with our many other presentations. To get there, just visit our site at innovativecomp.com, click on Resources, click on Webinars, and you'll be able to download a copy of today's presentation that you can share or review at your convenience. Before I introduce my primary presenter, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Ted Glutz. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing at Innovative. Got about 35 years in the legal industry. The last 25 have been immersed in legal technology. I'm glad to be a part of today's presentation. Ordinarily, at this point, I talk a little bit about our founder and talk a little bit about innovative computing systems. But today, I've got the honor and privilege of just introducing Michael. That's Michael Kemps, our speaker, and let him run with that. Michael?
Thank you very much, Ted. Before I proceed, is my audio okay?
Great.
Fantastic. First, thank you everyone for joining. I am the founder and CEO. There's a bit more here about us, and I'm much more interested in what you think about the cloud and all of that. So that'll be brief. Our agenda for today is to talk briefly about what we do for you, for our clients, to take you through a story in which we had a client come to us a few years ago now and say, hey, we're looking at a cloud transition, and you're our trusted advisor, and we'd like you to, dig deep, dive deep, and figure this out for us because we trust you, and heck, we don't know what to do. So there it is. And then we'll talk a bit about, that experience, and then turn it into how can the cloud, quote unquote, the cloud, whatever that means, right, benefit your firm. Sort of talk about the path that this firm took, and what their transition looked like. And then after, I'll pause for questions, and assuming we have time, which we should, I'll show you a brief demonstration of both, since we have more of a technical audience, both their backend infrastructure that's hosted in the cloud, and then separately launch a desktop session. So briefly, what do we do? I am the founder. Our firm's been in business since 1989. Our clients are primarily law firms, corporate law departments, a few government entities. And what do? We develop very close relationships with our clients that are strategic, that allow us to work together, find solutions, and establish and maintain long-term relationships, in which we have about 300 of them. So still kicking strong and having fun doing so, in addition to all of the technology change, et cetera. We have been an ILTA partner for many years and have won exceptional customer service awards. And anyway, enough about that. So tell us about this firm. Frenzel Robbins is a firm in Southern California. Many of their clients are financial institutions. So as you can imagine, security is a big focus, or was a big focus for them. They're involved in financial services, creditor rights. They have litigation and transactional practices sort of combined. They do some real estate, some employment. So they really run the gamut, outside of, no class action plaintiffs cases, and, no outliers, no family law, estate planning, but basically everything else they do. So what they look like. Prior to all this, they had desktops that were aging, and frequently I'll say that this cloud conversation beyond just mere curiosity and interest, starts to come up when technology is aging, when we're hitting the end of either our back or front end cycle, and everybody looks around and says, here we go, we got to go spend $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 again to totally redo all this. So what are we going to do? Let's look at the cloud. Typically, obviously, that's when this comes up. So a brief description of their backend environment. They were running VMware. They had a nimble storage SAN. They were running Exchange locally. They're using iManage for their DMS, obviously with SQL. They did have Elite, or do have Elite, DTE for time entry, and some outlier line of biz apps, and ShoreTel for VoIP. At the time the firm was considering all this, they were heavily contemplating signing a new lease and moving, which would involve, changing cost per square foot, real estate costs rising, economy improving, so not the best situation for a tenant to be moving. And they came to us and said, how would you guys feel about making our IT rooms smaller? At which point we smile, right? So they were looking at a smaller space. They didn't want to invest as much into air, power, cooling, management, the whole ball of wax. And in addition to all that, they were making capital expenditures like every other firm has done for years, buying into a technology curve, hoping for the best and hoping for no surprises before they had to do it again and had a surprise application that maybe they couldn't support later. The other thing that would happen over and over again, and I don't know if in South Carolina so much this happens, but for some reason in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, for example, large buildings tend to go through continual reg power testing over and over again, where the firms end up having to shut down all their infrastructure, restart it, does it come up in the right order, all that. And they were frustrated with all those experiences. So they wanted to invest in their new space. Obviously, in talking about the cloud, security is number one, right? Everyone says cloud, and the first thing they say is, where is it and how secure is it? And the other thing is, law firms, at the time, this was a little bit more bleeding edge. And we in the legal industry don't always like bleeding edge. In fact, we don't like bleeding edge. So let's talk about the path they took. We started looking at providers. So obviously, Gartner is a great source for that. And step number one was to start looking at Gartner graphs. Let's look at the industry. And as you can see in the bottom right of this one, in 2012, the industry was very, very fragmented. I see SoftLayer on the bottom left. They were acquired by IBM. You see Rackspace on the bottom right. I'll get to them later. But they actually exited the cloud business. Microsoft is nowhere to be mentioned on this slide, and then Amazon Web Services is in the top right. And for those that don't know, for some reason, every vendor's goal is to drive to be in the top right side of this graph, where you're seen to be a leader and a visionary, and that your ability to execute and the completeness of your vision is very high. So transition to 2014 and 15. Typically, this is looked at annually. And by the way, vendors have no ability to go to Gartner and pay them to give them preference, or, it's completely objective when they look at all these vendors. At least they purport to be. So I'll try and believe that. So you notice in 2014 and 15, a couple things have happened. In 14, things sort of quiet down a bit. Here comes Google on the left. Rackspace is still there. And look who's in the top right. All of a sudden, Microsoft shows up. Amazon Web Services is still climbing higher and further to the right. And then the same thing happens on the right side, except all of a sudden on the right side, here comes VMware. Now IBM has acquired SoftLayer, but they've dropped. Google shows up more to the right, but has dropped to the bottom. And again, Microsoft is staying stable, and AWS climbs to the right. So this is my opportunity to jump up and down and say, haha, I told you so. But anyways, moving on. So how did we pick them, and what do you look for? Obviously, performance. Performance. I'll also say everything I've been talking about thus far is public cloud, and the focus of this presentation is not to necessarily get so much into public, private, hybrid, But just for brief description, public cloud is where an Amazon, a Microsoft, or a Google is providing services sort of on a time slice, timeshare basis. They're isolating those services to you, exclusively to you, but it's available to you on a shared infrastructure. And yes, they do it securely. So how do you compare that performance? Well, you do a pilot, you load some applications, and you evaluate response time. You can look at third-party summaries that look at those providers or across generic applications. But sort of in our world, the iManage, the OpenText, the legal application environment, really it's best to sort of either do hybrid tests or pilot that on your own and evaluate the considerations. Which provider meets security requirements? I'll get more into security in a bit here, but the top tier providers, the AWSs, the Amazons, the Microsofts, SoftLayer, their core focus is on security. And I'll argue that it's difficult for us, as ILTA members to secure our own environments to the same level that these national and global providers have the ability to do so. Next is scalability. One of the best things about the cloud is I have the ability, as I need more, as I can scale up, and I can also scale back. And then, of course, value. I get this question all the time when sitting with partners and firms. How much are we going to save? And my answer to that question is to smile and say nothing. It's not about a savings play. It's about a transition away from Capex into OpEx, away from repeated multi-hundreds of thousands, or depending on size of firm, millions of dollars of investment in maintaining everything you have and transitioning it into more of an operational expense. So how can it benefit you? This is actually one of my favorite slides of every presentation that is done. Amazon actually released this slide, and I stick it in every one of our presentations because it's so descriptive of what happens. On the left side, with predicted demand, we say, you know what? We got to go get a SAN. We've got to go get a bunch of servers. We got to build this environment up so that I can make this last as an IT director, CIO. I can make this last for 4, 5, 6, 7 years before I have to do this again, because it's quite an investment, and I don't want my firm asking me questions as to the quality of my investment. But inevitably, what happens is you make that investment, and up front, you have too much technology, hence the waste curve on the left. I've got too much. It's so fast, I don't know what to do with it. I'm so happy, I'm smiling because things are much better than they were before. And all of a sudden, I get about halfway through that curve. I jokingly say that's month 38, because everyone gets a 36-month lease, barely pays it off, and then ends up with user dissatisfaction beginning. And then ultimately, the demand increases, the apps change, the environment changes, and your ability to keep up goes down, and then frustration, and then politics, and everything else happens. Transition that into the cloud environment where you provision the resources, both processor, disk, RAM, that you need, and you only take and pay for what you need. So if you need to spin up a matter and you're going to go set up a war room and go kill it and have tremendous amounts of data, and you need to do that for a 4-month period until the case settles, you didn't just go invest $50,000 in doing that and all of a sudden say, well, now what? Are we going to sell it on eBay or save it for the next case and have it degrade or whatever, right? So how does security work? On the left side, the word "our" refers to the cloud provider. So that the cloud provider in a public cloud environment will provide the facilities, the security, all the infrastructure, the storage, the networking. Effectively, they're providing a virtualization layer. So imagine if you're using VMware or you're using Hyper-V, take that out of your environment, delegate it to somebody else, let them provide it. But then you have the ability over to the Your Settings section to spin up your operating system and select what it is and what version it is. And by the way, upgrade it anytime you like. You implement and support your applications. You spin up either a network address translation gateway or a vendor's firewall that you're already familiar with. You have the ability to configure your network, the connection back to your firm, whether or not you're using WAN acceleration. and you have the ability to monitor it. And the point is, and to the right side, these cloud providers with those two things combined are able to achieve certifications and security in their environment that just far exceeds our ability, desire, and financial capacity to do so alone. So Capex versus OpEx, what's the difference? I like to compare this to buying a car versus leasing it. And obviously there's benefits on both sides. Let's forget about the mileage penalties on the car lease. So in a Capex situation, my strategy is to buy it and make it last as long as I possibly can, to depreciate it, and then literally to avoid buying more for as long as possible. So that, 7 partners look you in the face and say, we got to do this again. On the operating expense side, all of the tax issues associated with depreciation, with having to make lump sum massive investments, that all turns into a monthly cost. And from a tax perspective, I'm no CPA, there's my disclaimer, but from a tax perspective, it's deducted in that current tax year. And it's just sort of an operating expense that goes on and on and on. That also is a downside, because unlike purchasing a capital expense, the cloud spend never ends. And of course, the vendors know it. So what path did we take? We looked at 3 vendors. Rackspace was the first, because at the time they were very heavily invested in the space, doing well. They were sort of I'm going to call them a private cloud provider at the time, and they were sort of feeling out for the industry what everybody wanted and creating co-location facilities and setting up servers and renting them to you and calling it the cloud. And then they got into the public cloud business, started to have a little bit of success there. And then Microsoft and Amazon, frankly, ate their lunch. We looked at Microsoft Azure at the time, and in 2012-ish, it was developing, but it was pretty weak. We had a preference for Microsoft because obviously we're all very heavily invested in that platform, and we as a partner, we're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're very involved with our clients and those operating systems and all the applications, and so the automatic look was to look at Microsoft. Since that time, Azure has made a very significant jump, as you saw in the Gartner graphs. And I would say that today, had we not had such a large investment in AWS and our clients, that I would again take a very close look at those 2 platforms in your shoes. There's pluses and minuses to both, availability, number of regions where they're hosted. So currently, I'll flip to Amazon. Currently, we're using Amazon Web Services for all of the server and processor, RAM, etc., operating system hosting. And we're also using Office 365 for email. So we're using sort of a hybrid combination of both. We have firms that have done hybrid deployments where they've used just a little bit of this for specific applications. And we have some where they literally have nothing left in their environment but a firewall, a domain controller, and a switch with an internet connection or 2 or more. So what do we do in this environment? We duplicated their on-premise environment. Since you're paying for instances by the hour, and contractually you can reduce that by committing to longer periods of time, it's in your best interest not to just say, we need a VM for every service, a virtual machine for every service. So it's in your best interest to say, okay, let's look at the cost and economic benefits of spinning up instances, deploying services, and let's evaluate what really needs performance and what really doesn't. So you have to be a bit more careful rather than just saying, okay, well, I have plenty of processor, plenty of RAM, I'm just going to spin it up in my environment and use it. You have to be a bit more careful and economically wise about what you're selecting. So we deployed a remotely accessible pilot for them, spun up servers with applications, took copies of that data, and at the time used, and still we have some clients that are using Citrix to deploy their desktop. There's also another method that I'll talk about later. So we provided live access to a pilot group. We copied their iManage and Exchange data by moving mailboxes up. over 2 weekends and gave a selected group of partners, because frankly, at the time, the industry was in a state where, the trust wasn't there. They wanted to validate and support that, it would function and work properly and be secure and all the above. So they had that over 2 weekends. And then we took the deltas and differences in that data, copied it back in those 2 primary applications, and they were live in their local environment. Subsequently, there was a transition to Office 365. That didn't happen first because they were at the time on Office 2007, which, let's just say, would barely support it, if at all. So subsequently, the move was supported. So a brief bit on what worked, not so much what didn't, but things to consider. In a hybrid deployment where you have services that are continuing to run in your firm, but you also want to start adopting the cloud to deploy specific applications. We'll use iManage as an example. So let's say I want to take iManage, put a SQL DMS and file location server all up in the cloud, and get that off premises. But my local workstations are still accessing that application and are still opening documents from that data store. In that scenario, I might want WAN acceleration, just as if I had a remote office using something like a Riverbed. So when considering that, using Amazon as an example, Riverbed is supported in Northern California and in Virginia, but is not supported in Oregon. Now, coincidentally, their desktop as a service application, which they call Workspaces, is supported in Oregon and in Virginia, but it's not supported in Northern California. So a look at which services you're actually going to use, what your latency and performance are going to be, whether you're going to flip the switch and entirely migrate your whole environment or do it selectively on an application by application basis, is a great consideration. One thing we've had a number of firms do that are using Mimecast, for example. For those that are using Mimecast, very popular application in front of email and other security apparatus, it'll connect to your domain and allow you to log into it with your domain password, so long as you have a domain controller that's up. Well, that's all great and wonderful until the power goes off in your firm and you have no domain controller. And then we're all stuck supporting local passwords and helping lawyers log in with local passwords they don't remember because they haven't used them for 18 months. And so we've had a lot of firms that'll just connect their firewall to the Amazon backend, spin up a very simple low-end domain controller, point Mimecast at that, and that's it. That's the very beginning investment in moving their firm to the cloud. And then all of a sudden somebody will say, we have some servers that are aged and we want to move iManage. And so then this starts to build and the architecture starts to build, and that's one method of doing it, as opposed to the example of the firm that had to move and relocate and had everything else, where we literally moved it all and pulled off the Band-Aid. So what else? What are the downsides? What are the things to consider? Just like having a remote office, anything that requires large data transfer is going to require bandwidth. And so it's going to require time. Grabbing discovery data and shoving that up to a server today, large amounts of data so that they can be viewed in a lit support application. Today in your own local environment is pretty quick. Not so much in a cloud environment. One way that we've gotten around that is by using Microsoft DFSR, putting a local server on site, having local uploads to that server, and then having that automatically replicate to the cloud. So that's a workaround. Exchange migrations. So those that are still using Outlook in online mode will want to get away from that and go towards cache mode, even with more advanced versions, more current versions of Outlook that allow you to not download the entire mailbox when they log in and connect. So just like in local situations where partners say, oh no, I want all of my email, I want access to everything, don't take away my mailbox, I don't care that you can archive it. This is yet another consideration. Whether you're going to Office 365 with mailbox limits or whether you're supporting your own Exchange in the cloud, again, large amounts of data transitioning those connections is a big consideration. Printing, scanning, and burning. So not even so much burning CDs, but because that's sort of passé a bit, but but printing and scanning. So if I'm connected to a hosted desktop and I have a large collection of documents that I'm going to print, say, all at once to a copier that's local, well, that print job has to execute, has to transition down to, say, a local print server on a local domain controller in my office. And that first page may not print as quick or quickly as it did before. So printing, scanning, and burning, sort of all considerations. Import of data we covered, and litigation support data. So those were all things to consider. Another couple things that are not on this slide: VoIP, telephony, whether or not your telephony environment will even support being loaded in the cloud. Do you have to maintain that locally? And if you maintain that locally, if you run a voicemail client or you run like a ShoreTel communicator client, how well is that going to function reaching back into your firm and connecting to its database and operating and controlling all that? Do you have partners that dictate, or anyone that's using Dragon naturally speaking? There's always one hand in the crowd where somebody raises their hand and says, yeah, we're using Dragon, now what do you do? And the answer to that question is keep a workstation local. Sorry, I don't know what else to tell you. So anything that involves, it's sort of like Citrix from home, right? Anything that involves local access to ports, local resources, got to be a bit careful with that. So what do we do? What do we look at? Well, how large is it? What's my future growth going to look like? Uptime requirements. Where you're backing up your data, how you're snapshotting it, where all your current information is. Do you already have other cloud providers or SaaS applications? And if you do, then setting up a remote desktop, how well is that going to perform and connect, and what's the latency going to be to going back to that provider? Security and compliance requirements. We've had several clients, not to knock any vendors specifically, but just as an example, and again, not a judgment. We've had several clients that either have been in the cloud in this environment. We had one that was considering deploying a DMS, and one of their financial clients actually said to them, "You may not use net documents." My eyeballs about popped out when they named a specific vendor. So will your clients that are going to perform security audits on you be satisfied and accept the choices of cloud provider or hosted applications that you're selecting? I'm onto a question slide. Why don't we pause for that and see if I can answer any of those to begin with, if we want to unmute. And then why don't we go into let's see, I'm at 30 past. I'll go into a demo in which I show you both the back end of AWS and the infrastructure of the firm that we deployed, combined with separately logging into a remote hosted desktop. How's that sound? So any questions to begin with? And William, I don't know if you want to unmute, if that's easier.
Looks like Alex has a question. Alex, can you just unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear a little more about kind of end user difficulties rather than some of the infrastructure problems, such as I heard that there used to be issues with Amazon in using the 10 key.
You have been muted by the moderator.
Gotcha. Okay, now we got to mute. So William, you have control if you could do it. There we go. All right, end user experience. So let's talk a little bit about what we did in this firm and then what they experienced. So they made the decision at the time to use Citrix for their hosted desktop. We set up numerous servers that allowed Citrix access. So the end users were very used to booting up to a local workstation, logging in, and then getting straight direct access into applications that they launched on an image desktop. What they came back to after the fact was a re-image desktop that was almost a semi-thin client. It had a copy of Office loaded in case they needed it, but effectively they had to launch a desktop, get into the environment. It took over full screen or multiple screens, and then they went in and operated as normal. I think the number one thing that they experienced as a challenge is very similar to those that are working remotely in a session where internet browsing, for example, can cause CPU spikes, where accessing applications looks a little bit different. I'll give you a plus in that those end users that are used to using image desktops and then going home or being remote and logging into another system of some kind always got a different desktop. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Now, whether they're in the firm or whether they're on the outside, they have the same experience. They access the same applications. And in fact, if they don't log off and they disconnect, they're going to end up right back where they started. We still experience the same issues that we all experience relative to terminal services or Citrix in people leaving sessions open and not saving documents. So I would say that there was a bit of a short-term spike from a technical assistance or help desk perspective, but that slowed pretty quickly. The other is they definitely noticed the speed and performance of printing and had to get used to not seeing that first page spit out in milliseconds. For those that are walking down the hall to grab it from a copier, maybe they didn't notice, but that was definitely something they noticed. There was some frustration with those that are not as technically knowledgeable, working around, okay, I'm in a remote session. How do I deal with multiple monitors? How does it look? How do I minimize this session and go back to my local desktop? Just sort of that end user functionality of the remote session experience. Not so much that it's hosted in the cloud, but that it's hosted anywhere, right? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Others. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a bit and get set up to show you the rest. Everybody see my screen here? Somebody say yes.
Yes, see it just fine.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the EC2 dashboard. I love these acronyms. Actually, I don't. Elastic Compute Cloud. They don't want to say C twice, so they put a 2 there instead. Whatever. So this gives me access to, imagine like a console going into VMware and being able to see all of my virtual server sessions that are running. So here I can see that I have 18 running instances. I've got 40 volumes that are associated with those. Elastic IPs or public IP addresses that in transition to firewall and are supported internally. So if I click on my running instances, by the way, notice here that I have the ability to select what region. So they split their environments into regions and availability zones. So imagine a region being a location, an availability zone being a data center within that region, and the availability zones are cross-redundant. The regions are not cross-connected, and that's done intentionally. So this is hosted in Northern California. You notice the instance types are all here. Those instance types determine how much processor and memory you get. And so, for example, for a SQL server, I have an R3 large, whereas for a simple file server, I have an M3 large, which is smaller, domain controller being smaller. I can then go into the volumes, and these volumes are tagged and associated with those servers. We had a situation here where we had to resize a volume, so we noted it. You have the ability to allocate dedicated IOPS. So if there's an application that requires a lot more performance, rather than having to go out and buy a big SAN that will take an incredible amount of performance for just one application and not using the rest, I can size that up that way and just pay for that. Snapshots. Snapshots, somewhat like a SAN, has the ability natively, but we use a third-party application to grab snapshots. We're doing it every 4 hours, and we're retaining for somewhere between 30 and 90 days, depending on how much data we want to pay for. I can then browse through those snapshots. And so there's a product called Cloud Protection Manager, which is why you see CPM here. Talks about the policy that's been applied to that server, when it was completed, etc. So we have the ability to take those snapshots, browse them, recover them, spin them up as other servers. And again, this is all in the same region and the same availability zone. So the next question is, well, that's nice. What happens when there's a massive earthquake in Northern California and that data center or those data centers are completely taken out? Good luck on that too, by the way, but let's just say that it happens. Okay, fine. You'll notice that I can span over to North Virginia, and then it says, okay, I'm going to refresh your management console here. And let's start with instances. Well, this firm has chosen not to pay for and have instances available in Northern Virginia. But in fact, we are replicating snapshots. We are replicating snapshots from all those servers into that region so that we have the ability to grab those snapshots and spin them up as servers. It's not automatic. We have to go through effectively a runbook to spin up those instances from images, pull those volumes together and start them up. So it's not hot. It certainly can be configured that way if we want to pay for all that stuff to be running. But this firm chose to simply pay to store the snapshots in another location. And again, I have no instances here. But if I go back to Northern California, you now see all my instances available. Let's say for a second that I'm curious how this server has been performing. I can go to monitoring. Hang on here. And I'm going to pick another couple. And I want to see over the last 3 days, within a 5-minute span, how these servers have been running. Oh, look, we had somebody complaining on the 7th around this time, and that server spiked at a max of 73%. It's also a good way to just validate and see, hey, look, we did select the right instance types and sizes, and everything seems to be humming along just fine. If not, I can stop that instance, reassociate it with another type, pay more, and restart it. On to the point of paying more, the concept of reserved instances, you'll notice that all of these instances are committed to a term, and you can pay for them in different ways. So 36-month all up front literally was a check for an amount, and that covered the cost of the server for that time period. 36-month partial up front, you pay a deposit, and then they reduce your hourly cost. And by the way, when you see the hourly cost, take 744 hours a month on average, multiply it by the hourly cost, and now you know what that server is going to cost per month. So in a combination of all upfront, partial upfront, and you can commit to what you think you do or don't need over those time periods. And obviously, the more you pay up front and the longer the commitment, the lower the hourly cost. If you commit to a reserved instance in a time period, and Amazon, which has gone through, I think it's 42 price drops since their inception, once you commit to that, you do continue to experience the price drops. So you're stuck in the agreement in the sense that you're committed to a 36-month or a 12-month period. But if there is a price drop in that category, you will in fact experience it. So that's sort of a cool combination. One thing I'll say as a challenge is, or a downside, when you commit to a reserved instance in a particular region, you're stuck with that instance in that region, and you cannot move it for that time period. So in the example where we discover, whoops, we've got a bunch of instances in Northern California, but they come out with Workspaces, their desktop as a service offering that's hosted in either Oregon or Northern Virginia, and we want to use it, well, we can't really effectively execute on that and do it until our reserved instances expire, and then we can take, snapshot backups of those instances and redeploy the images in another location, and then recommit to those reserved instances. So there are a small number of things that, in particular around reserved instances, that commit you to a region. Not the end of the world, but something you should be aware of that we learned. Any questions on the console or what's going on here before I flip to the desktop experience? Wave hands. Guess not. Okay. So let's stop sharing that. And I'm going to share my entire screen. By the way, yes, I happen to be on a Mac. Is this going to work for me? No, maybe not. There we go. All right, so I'm going to share my entire desktop. I'm going to show you Amazon Workspaces, which is their desktop as a service offering. This obviously is different than deploying a Citrix environment. They give you dedicated, it's not dedicated hardware, it's shared hardware, but it's a dedicated session. So it's not like an RDP or a Citrix server where you're splitting up a bunch of sessions. It actually is true desktop as a service. So I'm going to relaunch my session that I was logged into here. And here I am. So my experience of launching applications, pretty similar. By the way, I mentioned that this was hosted in Oregon. We happen to have our iManage Worksite database hosted in Northern California. So when I click on this open, you'll see a little short delay while it goes and, did I do that? Yeah, there was a short delay while it went and reached out to the iManage server that we have in Northern California. What can I open? So it's as if I'm remote. Performance still pretty quick. If in fact that server was in the same data center, you would have seen, even less of a delay. So let's launch a couple things, and then let's look at Task Manager and see what's going on here. And again, that delay in desk site is exactly the same thing. So you'll notice that no other users are logged in. It's not like a Citrix server. My performance is only me, no one else. I have a workspace type that allocates me 4 gigs of RAM and uses it accordingly. Process is all running, performance pretty decent. And the screen latency is shockingly good as compared to, say, RDP, for example. So I'm going to minimize all this. I intentionally have ShoreTel running here to show that that works. So I'm going to spin myself into a meeting and then back. And by the way, that ShoreTel server is at one of our offices. So our offices are connected to the Amazon backend via our firewalls. They call it a virtual private cloud connection, VPC, but effectively it's an encrypted VPN tunnel. I'm at home, by the way, pardon the barking in the background. ConnectWise is a line of business app for us that's a little thicker, so let's run that and see how the performance is. And that's connected to a SQL database, so there's a little bit of a delay here. But it launches about the same speed as local, maybe a little bit faster. It's pretty thick. So I'll go to our service board just for fun. Have a ticket. Okay. Anyway, you can get a taste of how that's running. For screen latency, I'll flip-flop between applications. And then let's also do this. Oops, how about if I can actually type, though? flip-flop between those apps again. And let's do a close. Full close on the app, full close on Excel. No to the changes. Let's also close the line of business app, and let's relaunch Word. Cool, pretty quick. Now let's say I'm done with this. I'm going to disconnect. Actually, no, wait. Let me get Word back open. And we'll disconnect from it. So here's my Workspaces page. Everything else is still here. I'm going to reconnect. If it were not a very quick reconnect, it would have prompted me for my domain credentials, but it is not because I'm still here. It's relaunching my session. And I'm back in where I was. It's available on the Mac, on a PC and Windows, and supported in the various Apple platforms, etc. Interesting thing about this application, just for fun here at the end, I'm going to disconnect from this. Is I can actually see my networking status, my network connection status, and you can see I'm in Southern California. My round trip time to Oregon is 49 milliseconds. So when it comes to performance issues, I'm not exiting the application, running ping tests, all that stuff. It sort of goes and validates its own ability to connect. The environment that we were talking about before that's hosted in Citrix has a NetScaler front end, and their environment looks like this and launches a similar traditional hosted desktop. Traditional Citrix or RDP login, and in a second you'll see all the firm's legal applications. Ta-da. They've been up for a while, so they're on 07 still. If I do an open, macros load in the background, and there's iManage. We'll open something and then get out of it to preserve their confidentiality. And so there's a sample of being connected into Citrix and their remote backend. So both desktop as a service I've shown you, and straight into a real live Citrix desktop, both hosted in the same backend. The first one was our firm in the hosted desktop as a service environment, and then this one is actually a real law firm, in which I just logged off. Other questions? You want to open it up for us? I don't have control to unmute. There we go.
Hello.
Hey.
How will you deal with large amounts of litigation support data that is on a time crunch? So we have, a hard drive that shows up at our law firm. It's got, 4 terabytes worth of data. It's got to get into the repository for some serious crunching, and it needs to happen right now. What do you do?
It's a deposition day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
Is pray too unprofessional an answer?
I'll drink heavily with the right answer.
Tune up your resume is another one, I guess.
Tune up your resume. Okay, well, all right. Well, let's go through the obvious. If that happens to me a lot, and I have similar amounts of data, and let's for my example give me an escape and a break for a second, and let's pretend that it is compressible data and that it's not all videos and video production for a second. So one way to alleviate that would be to use, say, riverbeds on both ends, right? You can run riverbed WAN acceleration in the AWS cloud in certain regions, have an appliance in your office, and that will dramatically increase the performance of data transfers, of opening local applications, etc. That's one option, if that's even an option. Plan B is do a hybrid deployment. Keep the thick lit support application, keep summation or concordance or whatever, keep it local, maintain a small environment, but then you end up with, sort of maintaining both sides. So in the scenario where we're going to do a full deployment, we want nothing hybrid, and we have to face this issue, unfortunately it's WAN acceleration. And if that's not good enough, it's maintaining it locally. Obviously, having 100 meg connection to the internet would be very helpful, right?
You did get for me, Roland?
Yeah.
We have.
You need a bigger one than that, then.
Okay, a 7 gig connection to the internet. I don't know.
There's some comfort to being able to take a hard drive to the data center and plug it directly into the rack and being able to transfer all that data, in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and obviously in a public cloud provider environment where you have security beyond belief, that will never happen. In fact, they will never give you the address.
Okay.
I have NDAs with Amazon like you wouldn't believe. I don't know the address. Even underneath all the NDAs. There was one thing that I didn't show you that might be interesting really quick. Keep talking. I'm listening for other questions. I'm going to launch this workspace back up, and I'm going to run a speed test. So I'm remotely connecting to this desktop. I'm just going to go to standardspeedtest.net.
While you're doing that, I do have one other question.
Yeah.
Directly related to what you're doing right now. What about the end users who are at home and experience performance issues? I mean, we get calls, I'm at home, troubleshoot my connection. And of course, there's just so many hops between them and us. And how do you attack that kind of scenario?
Well, how do you attack it now?
Well, now it's really hard, right? So you do some of what you're doing right now, which is you do a speed test locally. You try to do round trip ping tests and things like this, and basically convince the end user it's their problem because you can't fix it for them. So
now, would you admit that outside of this room?
Probably not.
Honestly, if you were to go take a massive internet connection at a colo and spin up an environment and do all that, other than the ability of you being able to go to the colo facility and have your eyeballs scanned and walk in and look at the hardware, you're going to go through the same things. There's no different. The only difference is, and this is the same sort of frustration to a certain degree that you have with a SaaS provider, is you're giving up a limited amount of control, right? You don't have access to the hardware. You only have access to sub-virtualization layer. So your own ability to diagnose and resolve issues, you end up on a support call with somebody that has slightly greater access to that back end than you. In all honesty, we have not had to do that much. We have not been on the phone with Amazon much at all. Obviously, you see my speeds here, right?
Yep.
Let's do it again just for fun.
Nice. That's pretty nice. Of course, they are the internet, so.
Your mileage may vary, but it's fast.
It's hosted. Yeah.
We still have a couple more questions. Did anybody else on the phone or registered elsewhere have anything to add or inquire about?
Quietness. So did we learn anything? Did you know about all this already? Was it good info or wasted breath?
Good input.
Great. Love it. Okay, Ted, maybe back to you to close. The end slide, which I can put back up here, has contact info. If you have more questions or want to know about more about what we went through or anything else, let me share that again. And we really appreciate your time, and I absolutely love doing this, so thank you for at least giving me the opportunity to enjoy that. And there it is.
Thanks, Michael. And I don't really have much more to add. By all means, reach out to us if you have additional questions. If there was something we didn't touch upon that you'd like to get more information on, you can either copy down our information or feel free to reach out to us on our website. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.